friends. Today I will show you multi-tenancy in Spring with a database per tenant design pattern. Okay, as we know, multi-tenancy means whenever we have a single instance of our application which is serving multiple customers, that we call as multi-tenant tenancy. This is the term. So let me show you one example. This is my Spring app that I have developed, which is calling one get API, and here in the request I am telling the tenant or the customer. So say if I show you, I have three database. So the I am trying to demonstrate the application, which is a single instance running serving three tenants, and each tenant is having their own database. So it is database per tenant design. So my tenant A is referring to employee DB table database, my tenant B is referring to employee DB1 database, and my tenant C is referring to employee DB2 database. So if I show you the data, my tenant A database is having one record, which is Yogesh Bali, and my tenant B database is having one record, which is Yogi Bali, and my tenant C database is having one record, UV Bali. So if I run my Spring application and if I call this get API of employees, and if I pass say tenant A and see the response, I am getting here Yogesh Bali, which it is fetching from tenant A database. And if I change the tenant or customer over here, so my same single instance will now serve this second customer, which is tenant B, by passing this header in the request X-Tenant-Id. So now as you see, it is fetching the database of second tenant, which is tenant B, and giving the response from there. And if I change the database tenant to tenant C, then third tenant's data source is loaded and their data is presented by this application. So how I implemented it? Okay, so to implement it, first of all, let me tell you the advantages of this design pattern, database per tenant design pattern. It offers isolation. That means if say my this data is compromised or is misused for my tenant A database, then my tenant B or tenant C database are safe. Only this one is compromised. These two are safe. So this design offers data isolation. So my other database will stay completely secure. Second, it is very easy for me to take the backup of particular customer's database, because for each customer I am having a separate database. So I can say if I have some issue, I can take the database of tenant A customer and debug there what the issue is. So this backup and restoration is easy, tenant specific. So I can easily see my data in the database for that particular tenant and fix the issue that customer is facing. And the third is scalability. If my database is like for particular tenant database size is small, and for other tenant or customer database is big, so I can plan different hardwares for each database. So this is how this design helps me in Spring. But how it is working in the background, to understand it, I prepared this diagram. Here I am showing that whenever a request comes to my Spring Boot application, it first passes to one filter where I identify the tenant for that particular request. Tenant I am fetching from the X-Tenant-Id request header of that request. And then what I am doing, after getting the tenant, my application is having a database per tenant map, which is for each tenant there is a data source which is already there in this map. So this dynamic routing data source, which is a Spring feature, this helps me whenever a request comes, this dynamic routing data source act as a bridge, and it gives the response for that request which is having a particular tenant inside. It reads that tenant and loads that specific data source and give you the data from that particular data source. This is achievable because Spring provides us this dynamic routing data source class, with which we can at runtime decide which data source to use to serve the request of a particular tenant. Okay, so to implement it, I have, as in the diagram I showed, the request first goes to the filter. So I implemented one filter over here, which I can show you in my code. Just a second. This one. So here you can see this filter is doing what? It is reading that X-Tenant-Id request header and fetching the tenant, then setting the tenant in the thread locale, whatever tenant the request comes with. Then the request goes to our second component, which is controller, say this employee controller, which is a normal controller. It is just calling the service layer find all method. And if I show you this service layer method find all, it is also just calling repository find all method. There is no tenant specific work doing over here, but whenever a request, after passing from the filter, setting the tenant ID, and then it goes to this repository layer, there is a interceptor that I used. The request, whenever it wants to connect with the database, it goes to this abstract routing data source interceptor, and here it will see which tenant this request comes with. This we already set in our filter, that this request is for that tenant, which is over here. We are setting it. So now it fetches that tenant and returns it with this implementation determine current lookup key. So this method gets called whenever it reaches to Hibernate or repository layer, that request. So this method returns that, tells Spring that this data source to load. And during server startup, what I am doing, I am creating a data source. As you can see, during server startup, I am creating one object which is multi-tenant routing data source that I am creating, and here I am building data source of each tenant. So if I show you this method, during server startup, what I did, I created a data source object for each tenant, tenant A, tenant B, tenant C, whatever tenants I have, I loop in over here, and I created data source object and prepare this map for each tenant data source. So during server startup, I am having a map in memory which is having tenant ID comma that tenant's data source or database, you can say. So if you see these configurations, these are my tenant configs, where I am having 3 different tenants and telling 3 different database to use for these particular tenants, and then I am using this tenant loop and creating 3 data sources and putting it in this map, those 3 data sources. And this is how I implemented this multi-tenant dynamic source routing. So during server setup, I prepared this map. Let me summarize. During server setup, I prepared this map which is having tenant comma data source collection. Then I registered it to my multi-tenant routing data source. So whenever a request comes, it first goes to this filter, and it identifies which tenant this request is from, and it sets that tenant, and then it reaches to the controller, then it reaches to the repository layer, and in this repository layer, it is the default implementation. But before reaching to this, there is an interceptor that gets called, and this interceptor returns the tenant object of that particular tenant for which this request is. And then from the memory where we have that tenant data source map, it internally it uses that particular tenant's data source, and this is how it gives you data for that particular tenant's database. So step is very easy. First is you need to have one filter where you will set the tenant. Then you will have routing data source interceptor where you will return that particular tenant for which the request came. And during server startup you have prepared a map where you are putting all the data source for all the tenants in the memory. So whenever a request comes, it fetches the tenant and loads that particular database from this map. That is why when I am passing say tenant B, it is loading the database of tenant B and giving all the records from that particular tenant B database. And if I am loading it for tenant C, it is giving me records of tenant C database, because my tenant C database is pointing to this particular database employee DB2, and here I have UV Bali record. If I switch to tenant B, it is pointing to employee DB1 database, and here it is having Yogi Bali as record. So that what I am getting in the response. Thank you for watching. I hope this is helpful. Kindly like and subscribe my channel, and also pass the comments. I will read them, and this will motivate me to record further. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.